Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we're going to look at a book written by Scot, McKnight, and Joseph Modica entitled Jesus is Lord, Caesar is Not. And today we have with us Aaron Peer, pastor of Charter Oak Community Church in Churubusco, here to share with us this recent work by Scot and Joseph. Aaron?
Hi, how you doing, Herb?
I'm doing well. So tell us a little something about this book. What is the thesis of this particular work?
Well, the title kind of, I think, does a good job of summing it up. You know, Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. And so it kind of explores a new area of criticism of the New Testament called empire criticism. So is the Roman background strong enough that when the New Testament uses words like Jesus is Lord or Jesus is Savior, can we assume that they're anti-imperial? In other words, are they at the same time saying Caesar is not Lord, and that the empire or the imperial cult and the worship of the emperor is inherently evil and wrong? So is it a direct attack on the Roman Empire or not? So this book kind of explores that idea.
How does Scot unfold this thesis? How does Joe and Joseph and Scot, how does this thesis unfold through the chapters or the sections in the book?
Yeah, it's actually a combination of articles written by different scholars of all stripes. So McKnight and Modica are editors. So it starts out actually with an article by Andy Crouch. He's the head of Christianity Today, or the editor-at-large. And so he just kind of talks about empire criticism and just what empire is, maybe how the Bible sees secular empires at the beginning. And then McKnight and Modica have an introduction where they just kind of introduce you to some of the ideas of empire criticism about, you know, how we want to look at titles, how we want to look at Roman characters and how they're displayed. And also some, you know, definitely in the book of Revelation, you have ruler worship and just how should we look at these things. Then they have a couple articles that just are about the Roman world in general and some of the influences it could have had, some of the cultural scripts maybe that their first readers of the New Testament would have understood that maybe we don't. And then we get to the nitty-gritty. He goes through, you know, there's different scholars that are focused on particular books of the New Testament. Okay, here's what empire critics have said traditionally over the past 20 years about where to find empire criticism in these works and maybe how that's maybe not what's going on. So it's actually kind of a critique of empire criticism, not necessarily advocating it wholesale, but saying there's some stuff we can learn here, but maybe there's more than just a Roman background. Maybe there's an intertestamental Jewish background, maybe an Old Testament background that's going on as well, especially behind a title like the Son of God or, you know, Jesus is Lord or whatever.
What spurred you to want to read this book? What was it that was the catalyst that caused you to say, I want to read that book?
Yeah, I've been preaching through the book of Acts for about a year now, and there's definitely a lot of Roman characters. And, you know, I've always been traditionally under the influence that Hellenistic culture and Jewish culture, of course, influences the New Testament a lot more than Roman. You know, Romans only came in a few decades before. How much of an impact did they really had culturally? But reading the book of Romans, studying the book of Acts, there's a lot of Roman characters and different things going on. And also the Paul of Acts seems to talk about King Jesus a lot more than the Paul of the epistles, and I was just wondering why the difference. Is that something that Luke is adding? Did Paul kind of tone down his empire talk when he was writing his letters because he was afraid of the Roman Empire and spoke more in code? So I was just interested, and so I was kind of looking for some introductory works on empire criticism because wasn't really going on when I was in seminary, so just wanted to learn about it.
Okay, so your initial training at the seminary was more from a Jewish background bent, not so much from a Roman Empire bent.
Yes.
Okay. When you think about the book And what would you say was probably the most insightful thing that you got out of it? What was it that said a light bulb kind of came on, or that kind of took you by surprise, or you were totally unaware of?
Yeah, and I think I kind of touched on it already. Just kind of thinking through just that idea of maybe some of these things aren't just a Jewish background. Maybe these things aren't just a Hellenistic background. Maybe there is Roman things going on. And I was looking online just to see kind of what some other people were saying about this work, and I found an article by Peter Enns, and he kind of reviewing the book, and he talked about Luke 2, the Christmas story, just about all these titles that are used, that this guy's going to bring good news, that he's going to be Savior, that he's going to be Lord. And he brought up this Roman inscription about Augustus. And all those same words were used exactly of Augustus. And so he was just sitting there saying, maybe there's something more going on here. Maybe this is anti-imperial at its very core. I don't think it's 100% the case. But I mean, again, and I was thinking about our own culture, what are some words that we use of our president, or, different political buzzwords, and sometimes in a sermon you might hear those political buzzwords, and you could tell the pastor's probably coming from a certain perspective politically, but he doesn't really say it outright. And I think maybe that's going on a little bit in some of these passages.
Okay.
So I think that was the biggest insight, is at least give it a second thought. Is Son of God strictly an Old Testament idea? Is it strictly an intertestamental idea? Or could there be something going on with the Roman emperor as well?
If you were to think of something you wish he had covered, is there a chapter you wish may have been included in this book that you were disappointed that you kind of felt left hanging, you wish something else could have been further developed? Anything along those lines as you think about having read it?
No, I think it's good because it goes through. There's not really many passages that are under discussion here, and it's really young. It's only a couple decades old. I think I traced it back to a scholar named Warren Carter. 1996, he started writing about this empire criticism, and a couple other people jumped on board, like N.T. Wright, his New Testament and the People of God, and a couple other articles that he's written. And so most of these guys were dealing with what he said. Okay, he said this about the Gospel of Luke. Here are the 4 passages that we should look at. Here are the titles that we should look at. And so I think it was pretty exhaustive. And really, there's a lot of, the opinion was the same across all these different scholars. And McKnight makes a big deal about how he didn't choose these scholars based on how they thought about it, just that they were people who wrote about it. And so it's interesting that all of them were saying the same thing. Yeah, there's this undercurrent in the New Testament, but it's not the main undercurrent in the New Testament.
Okay.
There are other things going on here, and I think that's kind of the biggest weaknesses that they point out about empire criticism in general, is kind of parallel mania. And I've seen that. I've done that too. You see this word in the New Testament and you recognize it from Isaiah, and you instantly make the parallel. Is it there? Well, maybe. Could it be just something else going on? Maybe. And so you just got to be aware of just kind of constantly making parallels, and you got to think about it a little bit more critically than that too.
Okay.
So a lot of these, that's what these empire critics do. They just say, this sounds like this sounds like this sounds like this. And so then you just read it in rather than draw it out.
What are there other works along this line that might be helpful to a pastor? I mean, is this book helpful to a pastor to read? Let's approach it that way. Did you find this book to be something that would be very profitable for a pastor to read?
If they're academically bent, I would say so. If not, probably not. If you could just read some summary statements about empire criticism, that'd probably be good enough for you. But I think the helpfulness for the pastor comes in is, okay, if this is true, let's say that there is some empire going on behind the context or in the cultural scripts of reading the New Testament. What does that have to say about how we interact with empire today? And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think a lot of these empire critics, One of the reasons they see so much of it in there is because they're politically bent a certain way, and this kind of justifies how they view modern empires. And so I do think it has a lot to say about, how do we as Christians relate to a secular culture? I think this is especially true in America where, traditionally we've thought of America as a Christian country, and, maybe today people are scratching their chins and saying maybe it's not. So how do we live in a secular culture and still be Christian? And what does that mean? How does a Christian interact with their government? And maybe, if we can kind of discover some things about how the New Testament authors were interacting with their very pagan culture, maybe we can learn something about that. And so I think it's helpful just to think through those things from a political standpoint today.
Are there any other works that kind of parallel this that you know of?
As far as the primary sources, of course, you can go back and you can read Carter. He's written on a lot of different books of the Bible, so you can kind of see, what he's doing and why people are interacting with him. N.T. Wright is probably another guy that you could read. He wrote a lot of articles about, empire criticism and the Roman background of the New Testament. So I think, those places. And there's another one that people kept referencing too. It was specifically about Colossians. Colossians Remixed, Subverting the Empire. And it's by Walsh and Keesmont. And it's such a big thing in this book that they just refer to it as WK. So it must be, one of these big works, but of course I haven't read it. And there are a couple other introductory works out there as well. And you can just type that in, Empire Criticism and Introductory Works, and a couple of those pop up.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for sharing this book with us. Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. And thank you for joining us. And I trust that this might be a book that you might consider reading, particularly when you think about historical backdrops for New Testament writers, and essentially what were they actually dealing with in their culture of their day. In the meantime, I trust that you will walk with the King and be a blessing to all those that you come in contact with. Thank you.